So we're going to go to Karena. She's from Australia, from LGB Alliance Australia. And the first question is, can you tell us about the presentation you gave at the UN CSW, that's the Commission on the Status of Women Parallel Events, so that's for the non-governmental organizations, on the business model of youth transitioning? What was your presentation about, and where did the idea to do it come from? So over to you, Karena.
There are a number of different lenses applied to gender identity ideology to explain its impact on society: the psychological, the philosophical, and the legal perspective, for example. The lens I'm applying to this talk is mine, currently that of a system test trainer with a lengthy sales and training background in corporate, government, and education markets, a large part of which involved me bringing cultural change to large organizations who needed to adapt to new innovations in technology. In my last talk, I argued that the gender identity phenomena shares characteristics with a business model that produces a unicorn startup product. Think of companies like Uber, Airbnb, Atlassian, Instagram, Xero, etc. Companies whose market value is over 1 billion revenue each year. They each took a problem or redefined a problem and developed a unique solution to make a highly scalable product and become a leader in their field. I argued that the branding or identity marketing was gender identity. The products were the medical and pharmaceutical product line and ancillary markets to transition youth. And the problem they redefined was gender dysphoria, how to reconcile a youth to their body, whose traditional solution was talk therapy or watchful waiting. The youth transition industry redefined the problem to instead affirm that a youth is in fact in the wrong body, and therefore that body, via a product line of drugs and surgery, could modify the youth's appearance to that of the opposite sex. This new solution is called mandatory gender affirmation. One of the major business advantages of this solution over the old is that it's likely to make the consumer youth have a lifelong dependence on ongoing drugs, surgery, and hormones. Incidentally, with the startups, this is called a subscription model. I spoke about the business and legal risks to the industry, where the wider public may not be fully on board with experimental drugs, cross-sex hormones, and surgery on young people, particularly under 16. People who put the industry in a bad light, like desisters and detransitioners, investigative journalists, and outspoken people whose damaging reports and reviews all could have a negative impact on business. Then I spoke of the strategies that were put in place to mitigate risks of negative press, unsupportive narrative, to put a number of practices to ensure profits and remove competition. So, for example, silencing tactics to the left of the screen for dissenters, and some core goals from the Denton's Handbook for Young LGBTQI activists. All of these strategies have been incredibly successful. Few newspapers or TV are open to exploring the impact of gender identity on youth, women, and our culture. ABC and SBS major public TV stations are sponsors to the trans lobby, ACON. Gender ideology is being written into government guidelines. Corporate, government, and educational organizations have opened themselves to be assessed and audited on their adherence to gender ideology. And we've seen over the majority of sex-based rights for women quietly being erased. So industries don't stay startups forever. They become large, they expand, and they become entrenched into culture. So I want to talk about the challenges the youth transitioning industry has had to meet to embed gender ideology into culture, which essentially has been about a shift from material reality to subjective ideology. The challenges are to reframe worldviews and society's perspective, give the people a new vision, the ongoing need to grow business by increasing the consumer base, and always to silence dissenters. And lastly, ensure compliance in attitude and behavior. All this to ensure the longevity of the market. What I want to talk about now is that not all products are the same. Some products require a cultural shift in how you and everyone in your organization do things. It's not like buying products like tables, detergent, soap, or whatever. Some products require creation of an ecosystem or an infrastructure. An example of what I mean comes out of the early 80s. Accountants and bookkeepers were used to doing balance sheets by hand. Writers, journalists, academics, etc. used typewriters. Graphic artists used things like pencils and paintbrushes. Bringing in software like Apple and Windows 3.0, 3.1, and packages like Microsoft, Excel, Word, and PowerPoint was a huge cultural shift, requiring a change in thinking, work processes, the time it took to do things, the purchase of new devices that the common person had never used before. Training involved not just how to use the software in these new devices, but changing users' attitudes and feelings about this whole new ecosystem that they were a central focus of. If you were a software training consultant back then, you were one of the ecosystem's change agents, either external or internal to the organization you were working with. From one side, you dealt with the product makers, Microsoft, the product enablers, those platforms that enable the product to actually work, in this case, the PC or Mac, the product sellers, in this case, Harvey Norman. You got training, marketing events, and financial incentives from them to assist you to train your clients in the products. On the other hand, you work with your client organizations, passing on some of those financial incentives and creating internal processes to embed a new culture into the organization to have the users acclimated. That involved training programs, incentive programs, looking at how to language the changes, what rewards and sanctions you would give to the users, conducting assessments, audits, and giving them certificates and rewards when they passed, giving speeches, making posters and pep talks, all to encourage attitudinal and behavior changes and getting buy-in to this new level at all levels of the organization. This actually provides a very good analogy on how gender identity ideology is now being embedded into all major institutions of Australia's culture. I'm going to argue that the products that go with the gender identity branding, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, transition pathway products like packers and binders, etc., are the type of products that require an ecosystem or infrastructure in order to embed or lock in GI ideology as a sanctioned narrative and therefore ensure longevity for the market. I'll do so by looking at the roles of the key change agents and change enablers. A handbook created for IGYLO by Dentons and Thomson Reuters, which provides these young LGBTQI activists the goals and the strategies they should pursue to put those goals into law and grow their social change movement. The change management process that IGYLO and affiliated trans activists in this part of the world are trained in by the Activist Academy, IGLA, provides. I'll see if there are markers to support my argument by looking at the Victoria Conversion Ban that the TRA praise as the gold standard, and look at how the change agents influence that act. I'll look at the infrastructure the act puts in place, the commission, that the act set up to make it an effective enabler of gender identity, ideology in corporate government and educational organisations. The diversity and inclusion audits designed by ACON, working with the affiliate Stonewall UK, creates a one-size-all-must-fit policy, rolling out to all major institutions, organisations and companies which assist severe sanctions that a government might enact for non-compliance. The Victoria Conversion Ban kicks into full effect come February 2021. I'm interested in how that will impact on one of LGB Alliance Australia's members, Dr. Holly Lawford-Smith, very high profile in this fight. Recently, her University of Melbourne drafted a new gender affirmation policy based on ACON's Pride and Diversity Inclusion audit. So what ways is that going to embed gender identity into their organisation? That's what we'll look at. For change agents. I'll point out that why a startup model is so apropos is that the people that form startups and the young trans activists have a lot in common. Most of these startup companies in their infancy were small groups of young people, and the commonality with all of them is that they initially have no time, no money, no admin, no patience, and little expertise in all the areas they needed to be competent in order to bring an idea to market. Startup cultures have to be highly collaborative with other small groups like themselves to cross-skill in order to be successful. When it becomes apparent that they might have a winning idea, then they attract experienced mentors and investors who offer expertise in a whole range of areas to get their product off the ground that serves their products. If we look at IGYLO, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, and Intersex Youth and Student Organization, they serve the role as change agents in this ecosystem, similar to the software training consultants in the 80s. Essentially, they're the sales, training, and marketing arm for gender identity ideology. They're young. For example, they have to be under 30 years old to be on the board. They attracted mentors such as IGLA World. Initially, IGYLO had limited resources, but they've been getting world-class, excellent training. Let me just show you. Turn it on. For the last 5 years in change management, how to frame their messaging, their communications, arguments, how do they handle dissenters, how to campaign, how to project manage, how to lead, how to organize. I will pause this. There we go. The concern, though, to its own website, according to its own website, ILGA World was excluded from United Nations ECOSOC status until about 10 years ago because of its past links with several pedophile organizations, including the infamous NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association. It disputes the links to pedophile on their sites, but despite their strong denials, the proposals they make in their feminist declaration earlier this year weakens those denials. I'll put a list of links in the slides I make available, judge for yourself. But from its own documentation, it appears to be campaigning for the very agenda PI, pedophile information exchange, tried to push several decades ago. So that's who's influencing these young activists. And in Australia, it boosts members such as ACON, that runs the Pride and Diversity and Inclusion audits, and that's also who's influencing them. Two other significant mentors of IGYLO are Dentons, the world's largest law firm, and Thomson Reuters, a world-leading media conglomerate. Together, they produced a handbook where LGBTQIA advocates were provided with goals and strategies to embed gender identity ideology into their respective countries' law and culture. So if you are an LGBTQIA activist and you want to see how your country measures up to the Denton's Handbook goals, go to Wikipedia and look up transgender rights for your country. You'll find a chart similar to what you're looking at now that shows you. For example, here is how Australia is doing against those goals per state. Most of the areas green, and the red areas are the areas that activists need to be working on for their particular state. If you look at the chart, you'll see that they match up to the checklist questions from the Denton's Handbook that you should be asking about in your country. I'll provide the handbook link, and you can go to those checklist questions for yourself. For your reference, though, I have listed the core goals and strategies, and a link to that handbook in the following 3 slides. I'm not going to go through them. They're there. You can pause the video, or you can see this in your own time with the slides. There for your reference. I want to talk about Dentons a bit, but they are a significant product enabler, removing legal barriers for transitioning youth, which is important to their clients like Stryker, the global pharmaceutical company. As a mentor and investor, they are an incredible resource to LGBTQIA activists who sell the branding messages of the pharmaceutical industry. Here in Australia, Dentons is in every level of government, federal, state, and the Attorney Generals. If you remember, as a change agent, you tend to get financial incentives and mentorship in order to promote the message. LGBTQIA people can get free legal advice here in Sydney out of the inner west city, and they'll also open up a branch in the Sydney's red light area, King's Cross. Before looking at Australia's Victoria Gap conversion ban that we're using as a case study, we need to look at critical work that's been done in Australia. A little while back, a lawyer friend of mine noticed that a number of acts that once had the word sex were replaced with the word gender, all quietly happening under the radar. The word and meaning of sex, which had been tied to biology, had been replaced with the word gender or gender identity in legal acts. In the past, it didn't matter. Gender was a polite word for sex. But now that change does matter. Following is just a chronology of all the significant acts and events related to sex and gender. I'm just clicking through. From 1996 onwards, you'll see the transition from sex to the adding gender identity. You'll see highlighted in yellow, particular action to take notice of, which removes legal barriers to mandatory affirmation, embedding gender identity to law, and disassociating it from traditional definitions of transsexuals. I'll script through these. The points are there for you to see how much has been affected, and you can look at the slide downloads at your leisure or pause and read as you go. Click. Click. More. A significant thing to note though, when you replace the word sex with gender, with a simple redefinition of the word gender, detached from the traditional sense of the word, you can remove sex-based rights in Australia for all these acts in one swoop. So the TRA see the Victoria ban as the gold standard in the world. With my background, when I look at Victoria conversion ban from a cultural change perspective, I see core requirements for setting up an infrastructure that requires a change management model and the process of standards, audits, compliance, rewards, and standards to make the culture stick. I noticed the activist instruction manuals on cultural change essentially followed the Cotter's 8-step change model. So I thought I'd look at the required cultural change from that perspective. The first step is create urgency. So I was curious late last year, how the need for the bill came about. The initial inquiry, the bill was created by the Victoria Minister of Health, Jill Hennessy, and was not driven by complaints as had been suggested in the bill's readings in Parliament. Even in the LGBT rights page of Wikipedia, note that the last time conversion practices occurred in Australia were around the 1950s, some 60 plus years ago. In 2018, Jill Hennessy formally instructed the Health Complaints Commission, HCC, to inquire into conversion therapy, despite the fact that since the HCC was set up in February 2017, no one came forward with a formal complaint about any instance of harm from counselling out of same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. The HCC didn't produce a public report, only a 2-page executive summary. In October 2018, that was critical of conversion therapy that happened in the past and overseas, and therefore advocated legislative change. We were told that Jill Hennessy formed the view that urgent legislative change was required based on that HCC 2-page report. And on a second independent report received a month later, Preventing Harm, Promoting Justice, Responding to LGBT Conversion Therapy in Australia, co-produced by the Hetero, Gay and Lesbian Health and the Human Rights Law Centre. The second report mainly had a go at religious bodies, because obviously they need to be up to something, and had 15 homosexual people report bad experience they had many years ago. The report declares itself to be funded by La Trobe University, but by the 2018 annual report for the University of La Trobe Research Centre, it shows the unit is actually funded by the Victoria government. This was disingenuous and a lie. The report funded by the Victorian government itself then became key reason for the government to act and act urgently. Note all interested stakeholders that you would expect to be consulted in a democracy who would be impacted by this legislation, such as women's groups, parents groups, mental and physical health professionals, or homosexual and bisexual people who reject gender identity ideologies this bill ascribes to, were excluded. Excuse me. I'm going to tick off steps 1, create urgency, and 2 for Power Coalition, the LGBTQIA and their affiliates and the government. I noticed that the Act took the words from the second 2-page HCC report to create and communicate its vision. Some of its communication right there. You can read it in your own time. The Act sets up a civil response scheme, also involves empowering the existing Victoria Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission to create the commission that investigates any reports of people attempting to change or suppress sexual orientation or gender identity, and has the power to execute severe sanctions, up to $1 million to an organisation and up to $250,000 to an individual in 10 years jail time. It's one of the most chilling and concerning parts of this Act. It gives itself powers even the Commonwealth doesn't have. I don't want to go too much into it, but to say it places itself as judge, jury, and executioner. It's the big brother overseeing that a gender affirmation culture will happen. And the conversion ban did create quick wins. It removes lesbian and gay in the Discrimination Act, so we got erased. They're ticking off those steps too. The sex and gender definitions is so circular, it's left to the Commission to decide the offence and criminal penalty. I would argue that this is not only very useful, but I suspect it's by design, because it creates a situation where it works to have the Commission to have ultimate say. But the threats of sanctions also works to put in some kind of certification to put in place what is acceptable in order to keep the Commission at bay. And that's where ACON's pride and diversity audits come in, specifically with its diversity audit called Australian Workplace Equality Index. The diversity and inclusion audits designed by ACON came primarily from affiliate Stonewall UK's Diversity Champions audits, creating a one-size-all-must-fit policy rolling out to all major institutions, organisations and companies which assist severe sanctions that a government might enact for non-compliance. The audits provide some protection from the Commission in the form of proof of a gender affirmation compliance. They provide boots on the ground mechanism that ensures leadership is trained, experts are brought in to create policy, marketing, procedures, etc. They give benefits to consumers. They introduce compelled speech, remove gendered language, and control what can or cannot be said if it upsets the trans community and their allies. Let me show you something that I found particularly interesting in the AWEI audit. For practical purposes, with third-party audits that the AWE members will apply to its suppliers, suppliers will actually need to sign up themselves to AWIE to show that they can comply in order to compete for their business. Likewise, when they sign up, their vendors and suppliers will be required to do the same, and so forth. A form of multi-level marketing where people pay ACON to do business with their business prospects, and ACON has made doing business with them mandatory as part of doing business with AWEI members. Let's have a look at the member list. Okay, so here's their principal partner memberships: Amazon, SBS, Telstra, University of Melbourne, Victoria Police, Woolworths Group, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, Department of Defence, Department of Communities, Australian National Universities. They've got advertising, they have got the Australian government, ACT government, Department of Education and Training, Department of Defence, Finance, Health, Home Affairs, Human Services, Treasury, ATO, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Geoscience. If we keep going down, they've got not-for-profits, chemical, consumer, e-commerce, engineering, food and beverage. And of course, if we come down, the pharmaceutical industry. Now think about this. If you are a supplier and you want business with a large account like AstraZeneca or any one of these guys, and that is a requirement for you to show that you're LGBTQIA, gender identity conforming, you're going to ask the question, like we did as training consultants, what do you recognize as being compliant? And they're going to say to you AWEI. And that's what you'll sign up to in order to get the big business to win the tenders in government, large corporations. Who is ACON? ACON is a major trans lobby in Australia. It is in effect Australia's Stonewall UK 2.0. It assists in training activists, marketing, webinars, seminars, and promoting gender identity with strong ties to the pharmaceutical industry here in Australia. ACON runs Trans Hub, a site aimed at transitioning minors. The pharmaceutical industries profit from sponsoring ACON's promotion of gender transitioning, as they offer a range of products that transition youth to the appearance of the opposite sex, such as puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, castration, double mastectomies, facial reconstructions, and neogenitalia fashioned from skin grafts. They in effect are a gateway to the pharmaceutical industry's products. Transhub.org in effect acts as a marketing arm of the pharmaceutical and medical industry in promoting gender transitioning for youth, their products and services, information on gender clinics, and doctors that will transition. For example, AstraZeneca produces Goserelin. It also is known as Zoladex and is used off-label in minors to suppress normal puberty. Northside Clinic and Melbourne Centre for Medically Altering Minors' Bodies name it in their patient information. AWEI member organisations pay to be audited and ranked by Pride and Diversity as to how successfully gender theory is embedded based on criteria determined by ACOM. The program imposes a positive and substantial compliance and financial burdens on organisations. If you comply, though, you get a certificate or award, like a bronze medal or a silver medal or a gold medal. But it also serves an excellent revenue stream for ACOM's Pride and franchise. Here are a couple of things that are particularly concerning in University of Melbourne, which is disqualifying any speech that upsets the transgender and their people and their allies. Compelled speech, mandatory pronouns. If they follow the audit, they'll also need to remove gendered language or communications. The uni's executive and leaders will need to be trained and will be trained, and they'll have a requirement to market and promote gender identity through policy, speeches, media, and website. I understand from yesterday that they may take the mandatory pronouns off the draft. It's still a draft at the moment. We don't know how bad it's going to be. In April, here's something to make note of. Staff and students held the LGBTQI Queer Association. They held a protest against the associate professor, mocked, ridiculed, insulted, and defamed her. Female students that were there supporting her were assaulted, bullied, stalked, documented for doxing. All this was against uni-male policy that is supposed to apply to all. No actions have been taken on complaints made on that behaviour. So that is totally consistent with the treatment of those who don't support the GI narrative as dictated by your trans lobbies. So we see a culture that's supportive of branding gender identity and therefore assisting in product reach and expansion. Further, it shuts down on non-compliant behaviour with the threat of severe sanctions, which you can protect yourself from by signing up to the audits, and ensuring that each organisation will serve to market and push the ideology all levels of its organisation and any company or organisation that's associated with it for supply. In Victoria, the prior work by Stealth, replacing sex with gender, the commission, the audits, the activists who go between everybody are going a long way to embedding gender identity into culture. So in the end, there is a shift now, though, from activists as a change agents, young people, to organisations themselves, their HR, their marketing, their leadership, etc. They are playing the role as a culture change agents now through compliance to the audits and becoming the sales, marketing and training arm of gender ideology throughout Australia. And I would say once you have every organisation working to be compliant to these audits, in government, in schools, in universities and in major corporations, we will have this as our culture without debate, without discussion, without democratic choice. So here ends my talk.